The morning he moved in, I was still folding the laundry. White towels, his shirts, my husband's gym socks. All the fabric of our carefully structured life, stacked in color-coordinated piles. The dryer door clicked shut behind me, but the rhythm of his footsteps in the hall, unfamiliar, sharper than the weight of slippers I was used to, lingered. I didn't know then that I would learn those footsteps better than my own heartbeat. My husband had told me only 3 days earlier. He just needs a place to stay until the papers go through, he said, meaning the divorce. I had nodded. It wasn't a request. It never was with him. Only the tone of inevitability he used for work trips and real estate decisions. I hadn't asked why his son had nowhere else to go or what the divorce meant. I was too busy arranging the guest room, fluffing pillows, and placing a neutral magazine on the nightstand like I was staging the house for sale. The first time I really saw him, was in the kitchen. He stood with the refrigerator door open, back slightly bent, reaching for a water bottle. His shirt clung to his back. Not soaked, just close enough to suggest the shape of someone who used to belong to gyms and late-night showers, not long emails and spreadsheets. I had seen that posture before. In men passing me at crosswalks, strangers in cafes, but never in my home. "Sorry, did I wake you?" he asked. His voice was quieter than I expected, not like his father's, softer around the edges. "No," I lied, though I had been wide awake for 20 minutes, listening, wondering if I'd hear his door creak, if he'd make coffee, if I should put on a robe. I wore the blue wraparound dress I always wore on Sundays. It wasn't suggestive. It clung in the right places, but never announced itself. Still, I suddenly felt too aware of its texture against my skin. I wanted to retreat to the bathroom, splash cold water on my face, rebutton my collar, but I didn't. We shared the kitchen space silently, like strangers forced to navigate around each other at an airport lounge. I watched him pour coffee into the wrong mug, the one I usually kept for tea, and I didn't correct him. I should have. But I liked the absurd intimacy of the mistake, like he'd touched something private and didn't know it. My husband came in moments later, breaking whatever spell had begun to form. His presence, strong and familiar, filled the room, and I found myself stepping back, aligning with him out of instinct. We all made small talk, the kind you forget immediately, about weather, traffic, storage space. But I noticed how he leaned slightly toward me when we laughed, how his eyes lingered on the way I held my cup. I tried not to notice. I did. Over the next few days, the rhythm of our house changed. I adjusted my schedule. I started waking up earlier, just slightly, before my husband, so I could sit in the kitchen alone with the morning light, pretending I needed quiet before my first call. He would come in minutes later, always freshly showered, his hair still damp, wearing the same type of t-shirts his father wore 20 years ago. Sometimes we talked, sometimes we didn't. But there was something growing between us. Not tension exactly, but an awareness, an atmospheric pressure. There was a moment, 4 days after he moved in, that still clings to me like perfume on an old scarf. My husband had called to say he'd be late. I didn't mind. I made dinner, a salad, nothing heavy. He was already in the kitchen, cutting vegetables without asking. We moved easily, too easily. The way his fingers grazed mine when he passed the knife made me pull my hand back. He noticed. "Sorry," he said. "You don't have to apologize for touching someone," I replied. The words came too fast, too sharp, and I regretted them immediately. He looked at me then. Not like his father looked at me. Not like a son should look at a woman who had known him since he was barely out of school. His gaze wasn't intrusive, but it was certain. Certain of what he saw. The air between us stayed hot, though no stove was on. We finished the salad in silence. When we sat at the table across from each other like housemates sharing rent, our knees brushed under the table. I didn't move mine. Neither did he. The sound of the front door unlocking made me jump. My husband walked in, smiled, and asked if we had eaten. I lied again. Not yet. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay beside my husband, listening to his steady breathing, feeling the heat of his body without its comfort. He had become familiar to the point of numbness. When he touched me, it felt like part of a ritual. Expected, routine. I used to crave his hands, but now when they slid under the fabric of my nightgown, I felt observed, not wanted. In the morning, I dressed slowly. I chose a fitted blouse I hadn't worn in months. Not provocative, but it traced the line of my waist in a way that made me feel something again. I added perfume. Not the one my husband liked, but the one that lingered longer on skin. I stood longer than usual at the kitchen counter, waiting. When he walked in, he paused, almost imperceptibly. But I saw it. The flicker of acknowledgement. The intake of breath. He said nothing. He poured his coffee. I turned away, but the skin on the back of my neck tingled. That's when I knew it wasn't just in my head. There was a thread between us now. Tight. Invisible. Humming. Later that day, I passed him in the hallway. It was narrow, just enough space for one. We both hesitated, then moved in the same direction. Our bodies touched. Shoulder to hip, a full second of contact. I felt every point of pressure, every warm inch long after we parted. At dinner, I tried to be normal. I asked about work, about news. My husband spoke, and I nodded, but I couldn't focus. I watched his son across the table. He looked down when I looked at him. But his leg brushed mine again, this time slowly. After we cleared the plates, he stayed to help dry. My husband went to the den. He reached for a glass, and our hands met on the rim. The contact was quick, but neither of us flinched. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. But something had shifted. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I touched my collarbone lightly, tracing the skin he had brushed against. I thought of his silence, of the way he didn't pull away. Tomorrow, I knew we'd share the kitchen again. And maybe coffee. Maybe something more. I should have felt guilt. But all I felt was the ache of anticipation. The next morning began the same way. My husband had left early. Something about a meeting across town. A breakfast seminar that required him to be out the door before sunrise. I heard his car pull out of the driveway while I was still lying in bed, eyes wide open in the half-dark. I didn't move immediately. I stayed still, listening for the second set of footsteps. They came eventually. Light, deliberate, yet unhurried. I could tell he thought he was alone. That thought made me slow everything down. How I rose from the bed, how I stretched, how I chose what to wear. It was too early to pretend I was going anywhere, but I still reached for the black tank top I usually reserved for workouts. It hugged my torso closely and left my shoulders bare, the fabric just thick enough to feel deliberate, yet thin enough to remember. I paired it with a loose gray cardigan, just in case. Part of me wanted to look effortless. Another part wanted him to know it wasn't an accident. When I walked into the kitchen, he was already seated at the island, reading something on his phone, a cup of coffee in one hand. He wore a white t-shirt, slightly wrinkled from the drawer, and navy sweatpants. There was a softness in the way he sat, but his body always looked like it could spring into motion at any moment. His back straightened when he heard me. Not abruptly, just enough to show he noticed, that he was aware of me entering the room and that awareness mattered. I moved to the counter and reached for a mug, choosing one deliberately, my husband's favorite. I didn't know why. Maybe I wanted to displace something. Maybe I just wanted to see if he'd notice. He did. "You always use that one," he said quietly without looking up. I paused, one hand on the coffee pot, the other still cradling the mug. "He won't mind," I replied. My voice was calm, almost clinical, but my chest tightened. There was something loaded in the exchange, though we both pretended otherwise. We drank our coffee in near silence. I leaned on the kitchen island, facing him, my cardigan slightly slipping off one shoulder. I didn't fix it. He glanced once, maybe twice, and then seemed to study the rim of his cup as though it held answers to things he wasn't ready to ask. I could feel the charge in the room rising, like pressure before a summer storm. It wasn't that anything was happening. It was that everything was just close enough to happen. I turned away, opening the fridge with an absent hand, pretending to look for something. I didn't need anything. I just needed the space to collect myself. When I turned back, he was still watching me, but now openly. His eyes held me. Not possessive, not inappropriate, just intentional. And in that moment, something gave way inside me. I placed the mug down harder than I meant to. The ceramic clinked against the marble. I felt my breath shorten, as though I'd come in from a run. I wanted to say something that would shift the room back to neutral, but there was nothing left to say. I moved toward the sink, and as I passed behind him, he turned, barely, subtly, enough so that his knee touched my thigh. It would have been so easy to pretend it was accidental. But neither of us moved. His hand rested on the edge of the counter, his fingers just inches from where my hips stood. I turned to face him, slowly. No words. Just that space between us. Tight. Unbearable. My breathing was uneven now, and I knew he could hear it. The kiss came like instinct. No warning, no buildup of poetic glances or whispered confessions. Just gravity. Just need. His hand brushed the side of my face, gentle but sure, and before I could think to stop him, his lips touched mine. The moment was suspended, quiet, warm, charged with everything we hadn't said. It didn't last long, maybe 5 seconds, maybe less. But it left me unmoored. I pulled away, not abruptly, not in rejection, but as if I'd stepped too close to a flame. I didn't look at him. I walked to the other side of the kitchen and stared at the window above the sink. My hands gripped the counter. I didn't know if I was shaking, but I could feel the energy running through me, frantic and wild. He didn't speak. He didn't apologize. He didn't retreat. Instead, he waited. And in his waiting, I felt seen. When I finally turned, he was still there, his face unreadable. I met his gaze briefly, long enough to know he wasn't going to act like nothing had happened. Long enough to know I didn't want him to. The sound of my phone vibrating on the counter broke the silence. I picked it up. My husband, texting a reminder about dinner with clients. My throat tightened. I said the only thing I could manage. I need to get ready for work. He nodded. Nothing more. No pressure. But as I turned to leave, I felt him watching me, and I wanted him to. The rest of the day passed in disjointed hours. Zoom calls, emails, the buzz of routine. But my body remained tuned to that morning. My lips still felt the ghost of the kiss. My skin remembered the nearness of his hand. In the late afternoon, I stood in front of my closet for too long. I didn't know what I was doing exactly. There was no date, no event. But I found myself reaching for a soft, lacy camisole I hadn't worn in years. I slid it under my sweater. It was for no one. But it changed the way I moved. At dinner, we all sat at the table as if nothing had shifted. My husband asked about my day. I answered. He talked about his project. I nodded. I poured him wine. He thanked me. A scene rehearsed 1,000 times. But under the table, my leg brushed against his son's again. Just once, lightly. This time, he pulled back. Not with shame, but with restraint. I understood that. The weight of waiting. The new boundary we had crossed and could no longer pretend wasn't real. When I cleared the plates, he followed me into the kitchen again. I didn't turn to look at him. I didn't need to. I could feel him behind me, just far enough not to touch, but close enough that the air warmed. I shouldn't have, he said finally. Quiet, honest. I closed the dishwasher, my back still to him. But you did, I replied, the words low, barely more than a breath. He didn't argue, didn't try to justify. Just silence. After he left the room, I stood there alone, hands on the countertop, staring at the reflection in the dark window. My face looked the same. My life, on paper, was untouched. But everything inside had shifted, like furniture rearranged quietly in the night. I went to bed without speaking. My husband kissed my shoulder before turning to sleep. I stayed on my side, eyes open, heart open, waiting. For what, I didn't know. But I knew what I had felt. And I knew I wanted more. The suggestion came 2 days later, slid into conversation over morning toast, the way he always introduced things he'd already decided. My husband, cheerful in that clipped, managerial way, announced a spontaneous weekend trip to the lake house. It'll do us good, he said, buttering his toast with military precision. Quiet, no meetings, just fresh air and some time to unwind. He didn't notice the tension that bloomed in my shoulders, or if he did, he mistook it for stress. His default explanation for anything not quite aligned with his expectations. He assumed I needed escape, and perhaps he was right. But he couldn't have known what I needed to escape from. I nodded. I smiled. I agreed. I packed the car later that evening with half attention, folding sweaters and pajamas with numb fingers while my mind spun in a closed loop. I told myself this would be good. Distance, change of scenery. I told myself I needed the cold lake air, the flicker of firelight, the dull ache of silence between trees. I told myself many things, but none of them matched the way my hands trembled when I found myself packing a set of silk lingerie I hadn't worn in over a year. I stared at it for a moment before folding it discreetly between a sweatshirt and a pair of jeans. Just in case. He offered to drive one of the cars, which made sense logistically, though my stomach twisted at the thought. I knew it would mean time together. Close, confined. Both of us pretending we didn't remember how the last shared space ended. But he didn't offer directly. He told his father first, something about needing to leave earlier, run an errand on the way. It was the neighbor who would ride with us for the first leg, dropped off at a nearby town. That meant a few hours together, a scenic detour, casual small talk in front of others. I sat in the passenger seat, arms folded tightly across my chest, eyes fixed on the road as houses blurred into forests. The neighbor chatted amiably in the back seat. I nodded at the right times, laughed once or twice, but my awareness of him was total. The way his fingers rested on the steering wheel, the low cadence of his voice when he spoke, the faint smell of soap and pine from his jacket that mingled with the car's stale air. I felt every bump in the road through the soles of my shoes, every shared breath through the recycled air vents. The windows fogged lightly from our collective warmth. When we dropped her off, it was almost evening. The sun dipped low, gilding the treetops with that golden light people in cities pay to see through hotel windows. The silence that followed was almost worse than the neighbor's chatter. I kept my gaze straight ahead, but my body leaned half an inch closer to the door, like proximity itself had become dangerous. "We'll be there in 20, he said finally, his voice low. I nodded. Good. We didn't speak after that. Just the steady rhythm of tires on gravel, the winding road tightening between tall trees. When the lake house appeared between branches, squat and quiet and wrapped in the early autumn hush, I exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. Inside, everything was exactly as we'd left it months ago. Worn rugs, tall windows streaked with last season's rain, the familiar must of old wood and pine. My husband carried bags in, whistling. I moved through the rooms on autopilot, flicking on lights, adjusting blinds, opening windows to air the place out. Dinner was simple. Leftovers, wine, the soft clink of silverware against porcelain. My husband talked about a project, something technical and dense. I listened with half an ear, the other tuned entirely to the fact that he sat directly across from me, that our knees nearly touched, that he didn't look away as I lifted my wine glass, his gaze catching mine briefly over the rim. I looked down. I didn't drink. Later, when my husband yawned and declared he was calling it a night, I stood frozen by the sink, rinsing a dish that didn't need rinsing. I felt the quiet settle around us like snowfall. "I'll be out here for a bit," I said. My husband kissed my cheek absently and disappeared into the bedroom. The door clicked closed behind him. The fire in the hearth had nearly burned down. I added a log, watching the embers shift and flare. The air was dry and scented with cedar. I sat on the old armchair near the window, pulling the cardigan tighter around my shoulders, though I wasn't cold. I heard his steps before I saw him. He entered the room with caution, or maybe intention. I couldn't tell which anymore. He didn't ask if he could join me. He just did, sitting across from me in the low chair by the fire, elbows on knees, gaze locked on the flames. We didn't speak for a while. The silence was neither comfortable nor strained, just thick. He broke it. "Do you regret it?" he asked, eyes still on the fire. I didn't answer right away. I looked at him. His profile was all shadows. Sharp jaw, tired eyes, a kind of stillness that didn't belong to someone his age. "No," I said finally, quietly, honestly. He nodded once. "Me neither." A log cracked loudly in the hearth, and I jumped slightly. He looked at me then, not smiling, not expectant. Just seeing me, really seeing me. I didn't know what I felt in that moment. Relief? Terror? Desire? Maybe all of it. Maybe none. I stood to go, but I moved slowly, waiting, hoping for him to say something. To reach. He didn't. His restraint was both comforting and excruciating. I walked to the hallway, my bare feet soft against the cold wood. Halfway to the bedroom, I stopped. I looked over my shoulder. He was still there, eyes on the fire. I watched him for another second, then turned into the guest room instead of the one I shared with my husband. I lay on the unfamiliar bed in the dark, fully clothed, heart pounding. Not from guilt, but from wanting morning to come. The morning light at the lake was a different kind of light. Softer, almost reluctant, as though the sun itself was unsure whether it should expose the things that had been left unsaid the night before. I woke before anyone else. The house was still, the kind of stillness that came not from peace but from suspended motion, like everyone was waiting for someone else to make the first move. I lay in the unfamiliar bed, the guest bed, staring at the ceiling. The sheets were colder than I was used to. The pillow smelled like dust and something faintly floral, a remnant of some summer past. I hadn't meant to sleep there. I hadn't planned anything. But once I turned down the hallway and saw the sliver of firelight leaking from the living room, I knew I couldn't slip into bed next to my husband with that glow still burning behind me. My body was sore in a strange way, not from exertion, but from stillness. My arms ached from tension. My throat was tight. My hips, when I sat up slowly, held a quiet ache as though they remembered something my mind was still trying to file away. I dressed in silence. Leggings, a soft sweater, no makeup. I tied my hair back, not because I was going anywhere, but because I didn't want to feel it on my neck. Everything I did that morning was calculated to make me invisible, as though if I moved lightly enough, if I didn't open my mouth, I could make myself vanish. I didn't want to be looked at. Not yet. But when I stepped into the kitchen, he was already there. Again, already moving. Coffee pot on, 2 mugs beside it, like he'd anticipated more than just his own morning. He didn't look surprised to see me, just offered a nod and turned his attention back to the boiling water. I didn't speak. I stood in the doorway and watched the tension in his shoulders, the precise way he moved, the way he avoided meeting my eyes. I wasn't used to that. Since he moved in, it had always been me dodging his gaze, trying to suppress the weight of it. But today, it was different. He was careful. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't shame. It was restraint. He handed me a mug without a word. Our fingers touched briefly, the kind of brief that somehow lasted in my blood long after the contact ended. I stepped back, sipping, feeling the heat roll through me, anchoring me to something real. We stood in silence for several minutes, 2 people pretending they weren't aware of every inch of space between them. "You slept in the other room," he said eventually, still not looking up. "I didn't want to wake him," I replied. It was a lie. He knew it. I knew it. But neither of us corrected it. Later that morning, my husband emerged, energetic and oblivious. He suggested a hike, something light, just around the perimeter of the lake. I agreed, though my body still felt too heavy for movement. He kissed my temple before he left the room to change. I flinched almost imperceptibly. I hoped no one saw. The trail was narrow and damp with last night's rain. Fallen leaves stuck to our shoes. We walked in pairs, my husband ahead, pointing out trees, the changing color of the season. His son and I behind, steps in time, silence thicker with each passing minute. There was a moment, one moment, when the trail curved and my husband was out of sight ahead. He turned to look at me, just a glance over the shoulder, but it was enough. His eyes held something steady, something unreadable. He said nothing, but I felt the weight of the question he didn't ask. I didn't answer. That evening, the temperature dropped. My husband built a fire, proud of how quickly it caught. He loved that about the house. The fireplace, the woodpile, the idea of tending to something elemental. He saw it as romantic. I saw it now as distraction. I curled up on the couch, legs tucked beneath me, nursing a glass of red wine. The silence was cozy on the surface, but underneath it pulsed. He sat on the rug, leaning against the couch near my feet. His presence was grounding and familiar. His son was across the room, sitting in one of the old chairs, flipping through a book he wasn't reading. My husband eventually went to shower, leaving us again with the fire and the silence and the unanswered questions. He didn't move from the chair. I didn't move from the couch. But the distance between us was starting to feel like a thread stretched too tight. "I've been trying not to think about it," he said. I let the words sit for a moment, swirling in the space between us like smoke. "Has it helped?" I asked. He shook his head. Barely. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was heavy. It carried the weight of things we couldn't say. Not here. Not now. He closed the book, placed it gently on the side table, then stood. For a second, I thought he would leave the room. But instead, he stepped closer. He didn't sit beside me. He didn't touch me. He just stood there. His presence near enough that I could smell the faint trace of his skin, his soap, the fabric softener on his shirt. I could feel him looking at me. I kept my eyes on the fire. His hand grazed the back of the couch, barely brushing the curve of my shoulder. The contact wasn't deliberate, but it wasn't accidental either. My breath caught in my throat. He stepped back before anything else could happen, walked slowly toward the hallway. I watched him go, every nerve in my body following his retreat. My husband came back minutes later, towel drying his hair, talking about how good it felt to unplug. I nodded. I agreed. I listened. But my body was still humming. That night, as I lay beside my husband in the dark, I felt the mattress dip with his weight, his warmth settling beside me like habit. His hand reached for mine. I let him take it, but my fingers didn't curl. And in the stillness, I thought of the fire, of the moment that almost was, and the breath I was still holding hours later. Tomorrow, we would return home, back to walls I knew too well. But something had shifted, something I wouldn't be able to fold back into place. We returned home on a Sunday evening. The city unfolded in the car windows in a blur of familiar lights. Red and orange traffic signals, glowing storefronts, silhouettes of apartment buildings we passed countless times before. Everything looked the same, yet everything had shifted. My husband was behind the wheel, talkative, energized by the drive and the prospect of a productive week ahead. He spoke about work, plans to clear out the garage, upcoming travel. He was comfortable, even cheerful. I admired, in a way, his ability to carry on untouched, unbothered. He didn't notice that the air between us felt denser than usual. Or maybe he did and simply chose not to ask. In the back seat, his son was quiet, still. I didn't need to look at him to feel his presence. The silence between us was a vibration I couldn't mute. Not awkward, not tense, just full. The kind of full that makes it hard to breathe. At home, I busied myself with unpacking. I moved quickly, almost feverishly, as if by moving my hands I could delay the thoughts forming in the back of my mind. Laundry to the basket, toiletries back into drawers, books returned to their shelves. When I reached into my bag and found the silk camisole I'd brought but never worn, I hesitated. Held it in both hands for a moment. The fabric was soft, delicate, far too intimate for this space. I folded it carefully and pushed it to the back of the drawer. It wasn't time. Dinner was simple. Pasta, a bottle of wine, overhead lights casting a warm, dull glow across the table. We sat in our usual places, and he sat across from me. We ate in peace. My husband, full of stories from his day, left the table halfway through to answer a call from a colleague. That left us alone again. The second the door to the study click closed, everything around us slowed. He didn't look at me immediately. I didn't look at him. I stared at my glass, then the candle burning low on the counter. The quiet stretched longer than it should have. "You're different," he said finally. The words landed softly, like something already known being named out loud for the first time. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. He was right. After dinner, I stood in the bathroom far longer than I needed to, letting the water run in the sink, not washing my face, not brushing my teeth. Just standing. The mirror reflected a face I didn't fully recognize anymore. Not because I looked different, but because something behind the eyes had changed. I didn't look lost. I looked awakened. But to what? I wasn't yet sure. I reached for lingerie deliberately, not out of habit. Dark blue, lace, something I usually reserved for anniversaries or private moments that rarely came anymore. I slipped it on beneath an oversized t-shirt and loose pants. Nothing overt, but I felt it. Every step I took afterward felt more precise. My skin more alert. It wasn't for anyone. Not exactly. But it shifted something in how I held myself. Later, I walked down the hall. His door was ajar. No light inside, but I knew he was there. I didn't slow, didn't stop. Just registered it. The door. The silence. The fact that he, too, was waiting. We didn't cross paths again until much later. I couldn't sleep. I crept to the kitchen for a glass of water, barefoot, quiet. The refrigerator door cast a pale light across the room. I stood there, half lost in thought, until I heard him come in behind me. He didn't speak. Neither did I. I could feel his presence before I saw him. It wasn't startling, but it was sharp, focused. He approached slowly, carefully. His footsteps weren't hesitant, just aware. I turned slightly, saw him in the soft light. His expression wasn't conflicted, just steady, like he'd made a decision before walking into the room. He didn't reach for me at first. He stood close enough for me to feel the heat radiating from his body, his breath slowing as if he was willing himself to stop. Then his hand came to rest lightly on my waist. Not urgent, not rough, but unmistakable. I didn't move away. He waited, and when I didn't step back, he kissed me. This kiss was nothing like the first. There was no hesitation, no fear. It was slow, deep, full of things neither of us could say. It tasted like recognition, like hunger, like two people letting go of every barrier they had tried to keep between them. When it ended, he didn't linger. He pulled away gently, eyes locked on mine for a moment that stretched. Then he turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving me there, heart pounding, lips tingling, every nerve in my body lit from within. I stood for several minutes before returning to my bedroom. My husband was asleep, facing away, his breathing slow and even. I lay down beside him carefully, not wanting to disturb the illusion. I stared at the ceiling in the dark. I could still feel the weight of the kiss, still taste it, still sense the shape of his hand at my waist, the memory of the moment branded beneath my skin. This was no longer a mistake. It was a line we had stepped over. And now, there was no turning back. The days that followed passed in a peculiar kind of stillness. Nothing appeared different from the outside. Breakfast was made, the laundry folded, emails answered with the same polite efficiency as always. The dog barked next door, the leaves turned more orange, and the air began to hold that familiar early autumn chill. Everything in our world continued as if no line had been crossed, no lips had met in the darkness of the kitchen, no breath had caught in a silence thicker than words. But inside me, everything had shifted. I became hyper-aware of my movements, of time, of space. I noticed how close I stood to him, how long our eyes met, how his presence altered the molecules in every room we occupied. The nearness was unbearable now. Not because it felt wrong, but because it felt like waiting. Constant, maddening waiting. Like sitting in a car with the engine on but nowhere to drive. I told myself I needed distance. That morning, I cleaned the house from corner to corner, not because it needed it, but because I did. I pulled every sheet from the bed, wiped baseboards, rearranged the spice rack. As if order could mute desire. As if discipline could dull the echo of his hands on my skin. It didn't work. In the afternoon, my husband came home early. He brought takeout from my favorite place, something he rarely did without occasion. He smiled, kissed my cheek, told me I looked tired and beautiful at the same time. And I stood there, dish towel in hand, unable to meet his eyes for more than a second. I wanted to be grateful. I wanted to feel warmth. But all I could feel was the comparison. How his touch had become familiar, functional, like punctuation at the end of a sentence I'd read 1,000 times. That night, he reached for me in bed. Not urgently, but affectionately, with the kind of comfort built over years of habit. I let him because it was easier than explaining. Because it was what was expected. Because somewhere deep inside, I still wanted to feel something. But I didn't. His hands were gentle, practiced, but my skin felt muted beneath them. My body responded out of rhythm, like a song played too slowly. I watched the ceiling in the dark as he moved against me, his breath warm near my ear, his voice whispering words I barely registered. My mind had drifted elsewhere. Not to guilt, but to memory. To the way my lover's hand had touched my waist like he wasn't sure if I would let him. To the gravity in his silence, to the hunger in that kitchen-lit kiss. When it was over, he kissed my shoulder and turned over with a satisfied sigh. I lay still, eyes open, fingers curled lightly over the edge of the sheet. The contact had left no trace. My body, once eager, now felt like a room after guests had left. Tidy, cold, uninhabited. The next morning, I dressed in silence. I chose a black turtleneck, one that covered my collarbone completely, and pants that fit too well to be accidental. I spent an extra 5 minutes on my makeup. Not because I was trying to attract anyone, but because I needed armor. In the kitchen, he was already there, pouring coffee, back turned. The familiarity of the scene was almost unbearable. The way he moved, unhurried, careful, aware. He handed me a cup without meeting my eyes. Our fingers touched again. Lightly. Too lightly. We didn't speak. That day I tried again to return to the version of myself I had been before he moved in. I worked late. I rearranged files that didn't need rearranging. I organized a drawer in the hallway that had gone untouched for years. I considered calling a friend, but realized I didn't know what I would say. That I had kissed someone? That I had kissed my husband's son? That I had wanted it? That I still did? Instead, I wrote. Not a letter. Just sentences. Lines. Words. I wrote down what I wanted to say to no one. Words like warmth, aching, skin, silence. Words that weren't confessions, but warnings. I didn't sign my name. When I closed the notebook, I felt emptier than when I began. That evening, we sat together in the living room. My husband scrolled through a news app, occasionally reading headlines aloud. I nodded, smiled, offered a comment now and then. He seemed satisfied with our exchange, never noticing that my eyes never left the pages of the magazine I wasn't reading. I could feel him watching me from across the room. His son, not his father. Every time I glanced up, he was quick to look away. Later, when my husband left to take a call on the porch, I went into the kitchen. I didn't expect him to follow, but he did. The moment we were alone, the air became dense again. Not with guilt, with everything else. He leaned against the counter, arms folded. I busied myself with nothing, checking the fridge, moving a cup, opening a drawer. He watched. Then, finally, he spoke. "You're not okay." It wasn't a question. I didn't respond at first. I was too afraid my voice might betray me. But when I turned to face him, I saw it in his expression. He wasn't accusing me. He wasn't even asking for anything. He just knew. That something in me had changed, that I had lost whatever grip I had on pretending. "I don't know what I am," I admitted, the words soft, low. He stepped closer. Not enough to touch, just enough for his presence to warm the air between us. I felt it again, that charge, like lightning looking for somewhere to land. "I haven't stopped thinking about it," he said, eyes locked on mine. "About you." I swallowed, the lump in my throat sudden and solid. I wanted to say something. Anything. But all I could do was look at him. There was no right answer, no clean way out. My husband's voice echoed from the hallway. Something about where he'd parked the car. We didn't move. Just stayed there. Two people caught between reality and everything we couldn't name. After he left the kitchen, I leaned against the counter, breath shaking. I closed my eyes and tried to summon the version of me that knew how to live a simple, quiet life. The version who made grocery lists and folded towels with care. But she was slipping, fading. And in her place stood someone I didn't recognize. Someone who had tasted something electric and wanted more. It happened on a Tuesday. A Tuesday so ordinary it nearly disguised the decision that would follow. The sky was overcast, pale gray without drama, and the air carried that late October chill that suggested the first frost wasn't far off. I was wiping down the counters when my husband walked in, briefcase in hand, tie loosened, face lit with something close to pride. He told me he was leaving for a week. Not leaving, of course. Not in the sense that mattered. Just a conference, an opportunity. "A few nights in Chicago," he said. "Networking, workshops, dinners." He kissed my cheek as he spoke, already dialing into something on his phone, already gone in all the ways that counted. I nodded, smiled, asked all the right questions. "How long? Who else is going? Will it be cold?" I even touched his wrist lightly, the way I used to when we were dating, before children and renovations and anniversaries. He smiled at the gesture, kissed my forehead, told me I was sweet. He didn't ask whether I would be okay here alone with his son. He didn't consider it. It wouldn't have crossed his mind. Why would it? That night, I lay beside him, staring at the ceiling again, listening to the sound of him breathing in his sleep, deep and content. I counted the hours before his flight, the tasks I would pretend to keep busy with, the moments I already knew I wouldn't be able to control. The morning he left, he was gone before sunrise. I didn't get up to see him off. I heard the door close softly, his suitcase rolling over the porch. Then the engine starting, fading down the street. And then, silence. The house was different without him. Not quieter, not emptier, just unguarded. There was no longer anyone keeping the balance in place. No longer the structure of 3 around a dinner table, 3 passing in the hallway, 3 existing around each other with practiced rhythm. Now there were 2. I made coffee, lingered too long by the window, stood barefoot in the kitchen without turning on the lights. I wasn't waiting, not exactly. But I didn't move until I heard footsteps on the stairs. He appeared without a word, his hair still damp from the shower, sleeves pushed up. He looked at me the way he had the night in the kitchen. Unspoken, steady, a kind of pull I couldn't resist anymore. I handed him a mug without meeting his eyes. His fingers grazed mine. This time, I didn't pretend not to notice. We spent the morning in silence, each in separate rooms, pretending to work. The walls felt thinner. I could hear every creak of the floorboards, every shift in the chair upstairs, every movement he made as though it were inside me. By afternoon, I stopped pretending. I turned off the screen. Let the unread emails stay unread. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at myself in the mirror for a long time. My reflection didn't look guilty. It looked expectant. It looked ready. I put on the camisole I hadn't worn in years. The one I packed for the lake house but never had the nerve to use. I layered it under a simple cashmere sweater, soft to the touch, barely clinging to the shape of my body. I wore no makeup, just lip balm. Just enough to feel like I had done something deliberate. The moment came late in the day, after sunset. The house smelled like rosemary and garlic. He had offered to cook and I had said yes. Not because I was hungry, but because I couldn't think of a reason to say no. We ate in the dining room with the lights low, the windows reflecting only our own outlines. The food was warm, earthy, comforting in a way that made me ache. We didn't talk much. I complimented the meal. He nodded, smiled faintly. We sipped wine. We didn't pretend anymore. There was no more pretense. No more pretending that we didn't remember every inch of the space between us. When I stood to take the plates, he followed me to the kitchen. The silence was no longer awkward. It was anticipation stretched to its limits. I felt him behind me before he touched me. His hand brushed the small of my back, just enough to make me catch my breath. "I don't want to be careful anymore," he said. His voice was low, near my ear. I turned slowly. The look in his eyes wasn't uncertainty. It was permission. It was promise. I didn't respond. I stepped closer. The kiss came without hesitation. It was inevitable, not impulsive. This time there was no question in the way his hands found my waist, in the way my fingers tangled in his shirt. We didn't need to talk. Words would have broken it. This wasn't a confession. It was an admission, an acceptance. When we finally broke apart, there was no apology in the space between us. Just breathe, just warmth. Just the thudding silence of 2 people who had given in fully. He didn't leave my room that night, and I didn't ask him to. We didn't speak in the dark. We didn't promise or explain. We lay still, the shape of his body next to mine like a shield against everything that would come after. I didn't feel guilt. I didn't feel fear. I felt alive. And for the first time in years, I didn't fall asleep watching the ceiling. I fell asleep watching him. When I woke the next morning, it took a moment to remember where I was. Not physically. This was still our bedroom. Still the familiar ceiling with the faint crack in the corner. The same lamp on the nightstand. The same hum of the radiator in early November. But something in the quality of the air, in the warmth of the sheets tangled at my waist, told me that something essential had shifted. I was alone in the bed. He had already left the room. I didn't panic. I didn't even move for a while. I simply lay there, blinking at the morning light filtering through the curtains, feeling my body wrapped in the echo of his. The pillow still smelled like him. My skin still remembered the weight of his hands, the slow breath at the back of my neck, the rhythm of 2 people no longer trying to resist. There was no shame in me. Not yet. What I felt mostly was quiet. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of something stilled. Like the moment after snow begins to fall. or the breath held just before a word is spoken. I didn't feel wrong. I didn't feel ruined. I felt full. For the first time in years, I moved slowly through the house without a sense of purpose. No tasks, no pretending. I brewed coffee without rush, wrapped myself in a thick cardigan, and walked barefoot into the living room, where he sat reading on the couch, legs tucked under him, coffee mug resting on his thigh. He looked up. Our eyes met. There was no surprise, no regret. Only that same unspoken thread we'd been tightening for weeks. He smiled faintly, then turned the page. And just like that, we fell into something that didn't need to be named. That day passed in a rhythm both natural and surreal. We spoke little. Not because there was nothing to say, but because the silence between us no longer needed filling. We moved around each other like people who'd shared something sacred and were still carrying it gently between them. When I passed him in the hallway, his hand brushed my back. When I handed him a dish, his fingers lingered just a moment longer than necessary. These were not declarations. They were reminders. And I welcomed them. I didn't think about what it meant. Not yet. But as the hours drifted by, I began to notice something else. Not absence. Presence. A different kind of stillness. I noticed that I no longer waited to hear the front door open. No longer braced myself for the jangle of keys, the shift of the floor under my husband's step. I had stopped expecting him, and in that absence, something else had taken root. We cooked together that evening. He chopped vegetables while I stirred sauce, the movements of our bodies aligning like choreography. At one point, he reached above me to grab a pan, and his chest brushed my back. I paused. My body registered it before my mind could. Heat, memory, a shiver just below the surface. He didn't pull away. I didn't move. The moment passed without interruption. After dinner, we lingered. I poured us both a second glass of wine, something I hadn't done in months. We sat in the living room, the TV on but muted, the sound of the city leaking faintly through the window cracks. He turned toward me then, his expression unreadable, almost cautious. "We can't keep this," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't even a warning. It was just a truth, laid gently between us like a folded sweater. I didn't respond right away. I took a sip of wine, watched the swirl of it in the glass. "No," I said finally. "We can't." But I didn't believe it. Not really. Later, when I showered, I stood under the water longer than necessary. Let it scald my shoulders, run over my arms, rinse the trace of his hands from my skin. But it didn't leave me. Nothing physical could undo what had settled inside me. That night, he didn't come to my room, and I didn't go to his. Not out of guilt, out of understanding. We had reached a point where silence meant more than touch, where restraint didn't mean hesitation, but reverence. We knew now what we were, what we had done, what we were doing. It wasn't just an affair. It wasn't a thrill. It wasn't a mistake. It had become part of us. A quiet knowing that followed us through each hallway, each shared breath, each glance over the edge of a coffee cup. The next day, my husband returned. He stepped into the house with the same smile, the same casual warmth, the same routine question. "Did you miss me?" I kissed his cheek. I smiled. I nodded. And in that moment, standing in the doorway, the weight of everything I had become pressed into me like a secret too large to contain. I felt the divide between who I had been, who I was with him, and who I was now, standing between two worlds that no longer overlapped. He unpacked his suitcase, told stories from the conference, complained about hotel breakfasts. I listened. I offered the right words, the right laughter, the right rhythm. I was good at this. I had always been good at this. But all the while, I felt his son watching me from the other side of the room. Not possessively, not expectantly, just knowing. Later, my husband wrapped his arms around me from behind, resting his chin on my shoulder, murmuring that he missed my cooking. I smiled, laid my hands gently over his. And yet, I was already gone. Gone in the way you go when you've once been seen, truly seen, and you can't pretend to be invisible again. The three of us sat down for dinner that evening. Plates, glasses, silverware clinked. Words filled the air. But something else sat at the table with us. Not guilt, Not betrayal, just truth. Silent, constant, and impossible to unsee. I often wonder now if anyone else would have noticed the change in me. Not a stranger on the street, not a colleague on a video call, but someone who had once truly known me. My mother, perhaps, if she were still alive. My sister, before the years dulled our closeness into obligatory check-ins. A friend from my university days, someone who'd seen me before I became wife, hostess, caretaker, shadow. Because something in me has unraveled, not destroyed, not broken, just come undone in a quiet, private way. The stitching that once held together the performance of my life, how I moved, spoke, responded, has loosened, and I no longer rush to fix it. I wake each morning now not in panic, but in stillness. I dress as I always have. I cook breakfast. I pack a bag for yoga I won't attend. I greet my husband with the same soft smile, the same tone I've used for years. I listen to his plans for the day. I ask the right questions. I nod. But inside, I live somewhere else. He doesn't know. I don't think he could. His world is intact, unthreatened. He still kisses me when he leaves, still asks what I want for dinner, still laughs at television shows as though laughter hasn't become foreign to me. His son and I are careful now. Incredibly, exhaustingly careful. We no longer touch, not in ways that could be noticed, not in ways that could be named. There are no more stolen kisses, no more whispered sentences in the dark, no more footsteps in the hall at night. But in every room, I feel him. When I pass by him in the kitchen, the hairs on my arms rise. When I hand him a dish, I feel the tremble in my wrist. When he says, "Thank you," I hear everything behind the words he doesn't say. I see it in the pause before he leaves the room, in the way his gaze always drifts toward the window as though watching for something we both know will never come. We don't talk about it. We haven't since the morning after my husband returned, but it lives between us now. This silent, aching truth. Not a weight, a presence, like a second heartbeat. There are moments I forget, moments I pretend. Like the Sunday afternoon we all drove to the farmer's market together, plastic bags of apples and herbs weighing down my hands, the sun warm on my shoulders, the three of us laughing as we struggled to pack everything into the trunk. My husband kissed my cheek before taking the cart back. His son caught my eye in the rearview mirror, and for a breath, the world held still. I imagined, for one reckless moment, what it would be like to keep moving forward in that direction. What if we just kept driving? What if we found somewhere far enough that names and roles and expectations no longer held power? But the light changed. The car moved. The day continued. Later that evening, I stood in front of the mirror again. I wore the same blouse I'd worn 100 times. The same earrings. The same neutral lipstick. But under it, I wore the same lace camisole from that night. I don't know why. It wasn't for him. He wouldn't see it. We wouldn't be alone. But I needed to feel something against my skin that reminded me I was still capable of choosing. My husband walked in behind me while I was brushing my hair. "You ready?" he asked, already buttoning his cuff. I nodded. Almost. He smiled. "You look nice tonight." I thanked him. He didn't notice the pause in my voice. That night at the restaurant, we met friends. We toasted promotions, laughed at old stories, discussed news headlines and vacation plans. I played my part so well I almost believed it. Almost. But every now and then, I'd catch myself drifting. Not toward fantasy, not toward guilt, but toward memory. Not of one specific moment, but of what it felt like to be wanted in silence. To be known without having to speak. To be undone, not by hands or heat, but by being truly seen. And now I live with that knowing. Not regret. Not longing. Just the irrevocable shift that comes from crossing a line you can never uncross. A line not of action, but of becoming. Because the truth is this. It wasn't the kiss that changed me, or the night, or the ache. It was the fact that I let myself want something again. And now, even when I walk through my days in the same shoes, in the same rooms, among the same people, I'm no longer who I was. At dinner, my husband touched my hand across the table. I smiled. But later, when we returned home and I undressed quietly in the dark, hanging my blouse on the hook, I didn't remove the lace camisole beneath. I slid into bed beside him, his breathing already steady, his body turned towards sleep. And I closed my eyes, not to rest, but to feel, to remember, to carry gently the secret that had become a part of me. A truth without a future. A wound without a scar. A fire still burning, quietly, behind my ribs.